CCS, in one form or another, is what puts the net in net zero. It's capturing a source from things that you can't do anything else about. And also, it's taking carbon dioxide out of the air for things that you can't avoid doing.
It would bring down the cost of decarbonisation very substantially. And that's a societal cost. So it's not just a cost to be borne by oil and gas firms, it's a cost that would be borne by all of us.
Welcome to Emissions Impossible. I'm Kim McAllister.
And I'm Mike Stephenson.
Everybody get up.
So I am a broadcast journalist, and Mike, you're the Executive Chief Scientist at the Natural Environment Research Council's British Geological Survey. What does your work involve?
I'm a scientist who works mostly in net zero and decarbonisation. So I think about ways that geologically we can solve the net zero problem.
So when people think about net zero, we're obviously thinking about emissions. And I guess the reference point is emissions from cars, emissions from factories. And we're probably aware that trees and peatland play a role in taking some of the emissions out of the atmosphere. How does that work?
Well, there's loads of ways that the natural world can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So peatlands and woods, so trees, any kind of plant that photosynthesizes is essentially taking carbon dioxide out and releasing oxygen. And they've been doing it for millions and millions of years. There are even rocks that do this. There's a particular kind of rock called an ultra-basic rock, which is volcanic in origin. And that also naturally sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the Earth is kind of doing it all the time in its own natural way. But it also, in a way, because we have put so much CO2 in so fast because of the Industrial Revolution, we need to kind of speed up nature's kind of ability to absorb CO2.
So can you put it in some kind of context in terms of what is the natural rate, what have we done, and what's the problem?
Well, the natural rate of CO2 absorption, if you like, is quite considerable. But what we've got to realise that about halfway through the 18th century, we essentially invented the steam engine. James Watt invented it, and it was put into practice, and it meant that we could use an enormous amount of coal, basically. So we switched our ways of putting energy into the environment by basically using fossil fuels. Before that, we just used sources of energy like falling water and the wind, in the past. But we basically got this kind of clamoring for coal, and that became the Industrial Revolution. And the thing is that we put lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that previously was way below the surface. And that's the problem. So we put CO2 in the atmosphere much faster then the Earth naturally can kind of get rid of it. So the balance is lost. And as a geologist, I'm acutely aware of that because, over geological time, over millions of years, you can see that happening elsewhere when volcanoes blow up, 1 million years ago or 100 million years ago. They do the same thing, destroy the balance. But here, human beings have kind of destroyed the balance a bit.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like we've only come to this quite late. I feel like we've turned up at the party after everybody's already drunk and we need to kind of go, oh my goodness, we all need to sober up really, really quickly. Why do you think it's taken us this long to go, oh my goodness?
Well, in fact, we're actually quite good at this. I'd kind of argue that at times we're quite good at identifying a problem and dealing with it. And give an example is the ozone holes, that they were discovered by scientists. We realized there was a problem. It was very quickly disseminated that there was a problem, and basically we did something about it. We got rid of CFCs to some extent, and the ozone holes are getting smaller. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up to say that we're really bad at dealing with problems. We actually do deal with them quite well. But I guess to answer your question, in this case, dealing with the problem involves the way we live, the cars we drive, if we drive, the meat that we might eat or might not eat. And it affects, the way we live our lives. And so that's harder to adjust to. Something like the ozone hole could be done technologically. You can fix it technologically without asking people to change the way the car they drive or whatever. Here we're asking for something different. Also, we're probably asking people to pay a little bit more for energy, for example, because we're going to have to generate it, in slightly different ways, or generate it with extra bits of technology on top to fix the emissions problem. So that probably accounts for the fact that it's a bit slower. There's another reason as well, and that is that, in fact, until recently, I think people felt that all these scientists were banging on about climate change, but they couldn't see it really happening. And they just thought, well, I can't see anything happening and there's no problem. Why should I do anything about it? But I think that's probably changed in the last year or 6 months, with the fires raging, the obvious sort of weather instability, that probably people are beginning to connect with it as a real problem that's affecting them.
I definitely think that awareness is as high as it's ever been, and people are beginning to panic a little bit, I think. So hopefully during the course of this podcast, we'll start to reassure them slightly that the scientists are on it, the innovation is happening. And what I'm really interested in with this episode, and it's something you're obviously an expert in, is how industrial emissions can be removed. So
they can be reduced through this technology called carbon capture and storage, which is collecting the carbon dioxide at the source, from the chimneys that these big factories and power stations and refineries, where they produce the CO2, getting it, collecting it and taking it in a pipeline and then injecting it into the rocks, deep rocks under the sea, in the North Sea mainly. A lot of the emissions are concentrated in industrial clusters. So anywhere in Britain, if you think of Humberside or Northwest England or around the Firth of Forth, you've got power stations, refineries and factories, and those produce a lot of our emissions. So to talk more about this fantastic technology, actually, we've got our first guest, Jon Gibbins. So the first thing I asked him was, how do we actually pull the carbon dioxide out of these places and get it back into the ground?
So you're basically taking carbon dioxide that would otherwise stay in the air for a long, long time, and you're putting it usually deep underground, 1 kilometre or more underground, in places where it'll stay for geological time. So tens, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. So usually this carbon will have come out of the ground anyway from a fossil source, and you're making sure it goes back. That's the basic principle. But you might be taking the carbon dioxide from the point you're producing it, where you're generating electricity or burning some fuel to raise heat. Or you might also take it from the air. And you could do that 2 main ways. One is to capture CO2 when you're burning biomass. So the trees have taken the CO2 out of the air. Then you make sure it doesn't go back again. Or you might take it out of the air directly itself, and that might seem like capture impossible because it's very dilute. But actually, it's funny, the thermodynamics needs to take you twice as much energy as taking it out from the chimney of a power plant. So it's not actually that impossible.
So assuming we've captured the carbon, how do we get it under the ground and how do we keep it there?
So we capture the carbon dioxide, not carbon. You compress it, and it turns into basically a liquid, about half the density of water. And then you can pump it through pipes. You've got to keep it at the pressure somewhere above 100 atmospheres. And then you put it down, another pipe going down into the ground, I say at least 1 kilometre, into an area that's basically porous. So, on a beach, if you're on a beach, the waves come in and then they sink through the beach after they sort of ripple up. Well, carbon dioxide will do exactly the same thing. It'll sink through sand that used to be a beach. And now that sand is 1 kilometre underground. It's turned into sandstone rock, but you've still got the pores between the different grains. And the CO2 will go into those pores. It'll displace the water that's there and basically just stop in those pores forever.
So are there places in the UK where we can do this, or are we looking elsewhere in the world?
Well, so no places really in the UK on land. Same way we don't have oil and gas to any extent on land in the UK. But we do have a lot of oil and gas offshore. Mm-hmm. And that means that in the North Sea and the Irish Sea, we've got quite a lot of these places where you can store CO2, either in the old oil and gas fields, and those are good because you know that they've got the right structure, and you know what happens to oil and gas as they flow out of these porous layers, but also in other places.
A lot of potential. And is it as simple as reversing an oil well, or is it a whole different set of technology?
No, it's a very similar technology, but the detail of reversing an oil well involves a few things. So, for example, you've got to put carbon dioxide down this long injection well, and so the materials have to be compatible with carbon dioxide. You've got to think about what happens in the formation as you pump something in rather than take things out. But no, it's fairly similar. The flow, once you get away from the well, the flow in the reservoir is quite similar to the flows that people have in oil and gas reservoirs. So you can do a lot of crossover, but not everything.
And is that happening yet, or is this future technology?
No. So there's an injection been going on, I guess, only about 500 miles from where we are, off the coast of Norway, where from 1996 they were producing about 1 million tons a year of carbon dioxide from natural gas processing, extracting natural gas with too much carbon dioxide in that had to be taken out before they could use it. And then this carbon dioxide has been pushed a kilometre underground into a very, very open formation, 1 million tons a year. And so it's been going on for 20 years. And the reason they did it was, even then, Norway applied on its offshore operations a very high carbon tax. So they could actually fund putting this CO2 away in this reservoir. If people want to look it up, it's called Sleipner.
Wow.
And they can look it up, and it's been storing that. And Norway's got another site now on an LNG plant. Been a number of projects going on in North America that have worked both for storage in aquifers, places without oil and gas, and also quite a lot of places where they've used used CO2 to help get oil out of the ground. Because one of the things that you probably have come across, at least the effects of this liquid CO2, every time you have a decaffeinated coffee.
Oh, what's the link?
The caffeine is washed out of it with supercritical CO2 because it's a great solvent.
Right.
And of course, it just boils off and you don't get any residue left behind. I came across a paper from 1983 where people were looking at capturing carbon dioxide from coal-fired power plants in the UK and using it for enhanced oil recovery in the North Sea because it was the oil crisis. And it was worth it. They never did it, but it very, very similar to what we're planning now.
Oh, if only we'd started in 1983, we might be in a better place right now.
Yes, well, I think that's true. Although whether people would have actually used the right technology that we could use now. So the capture was important, though. If we developed that would have been useful.
Yeah.
I mean, we came close to getting something going on carbon capture back in about 2000. It started in 2005. I don't know whether you remember, but the UK ran a conference in Gleneagles when we were president of the EU and chair of the G8 at the same time. And we ran a conference which pushed a lot on climate. And that conference actually brought carbon capture and storage to the fore globally for the first time. Part of that conference, BP offered to do a carbon capture and storage project at a power plant in Scotland called Peterhead. That power plant had a pipeline going to a gas field that had a lot of carbon dioxide in it, and they were going to reverse the flow and put effectively all carbon dioxide back into the field. And they came pretty close to building the plant. The only problem was they basically picked the wrong technology to do it. Oh. So they wanted to make hydrogen out of the natural gas and then burn the hydrogen. And actually, that's a very expensive way of cutting carbon dioxide emissions in a power plant. It's better to burn the natural gas and capture the carbon dioxide from the chimney.
Right.
And I think had they done that, it would have actually been seen as a cost-effective and relevant project. And that would have got built. That would have been running about 2010, I think, if not earlier. So so close.
Another 11, 12 years wasted.
Yeah. It was funny. We were seeing it all again. We'd had a period of very, very cheap natural gas, and nobody could imagine building a coal-fired power plant. That was 2005. And then very soon after that, natural gas prices went through the roof, and all of the UK companies said, we've got to build some new coal-fired power plants so we don't get held to ransom by Russia. And they were really planning to do that. And we had some huge climate camps. So the way the government took it seriously was they said, OK, in the end, basically, every power plant's going to have enough carbon capture and storage to fit natural gas. With cross-party support, just before the 2010 general election, Labour and Conservatives collaborated to put forward a bill that had an 11 billion CCS levy in to pay for this capture on every coal plant. Between the gas price going high and people actually getting on with this, we had the recession, which cut demand for electricity and cut demand for natural gas. And then following on fairly soon after that, we had shale gas appearing in the US, which cut gas prices. And none of the utilities then could justify building coal plant. So a program that was absolutely priority, all ready to go, but was linked to coal plants, didn't happen. So we missed carbon capture and storage again. Interesting, isn't it?
It's really interesting, and also kind of heartbreaking because, imagine how different things could be.
Well, it made sense. It made sense at the time. So then we started trying to get CCS going, but actually at that point, now natural gas was seen to be cheap, and we had an 80% emission reduction target by 2020. People basically said, well, it's okay. We can get 80% if we have a solution which I call gas and wind, if you'll excuse the pun. It's basically, you have lots of wind power, and use that as much as you can. For the bits you can't, it's okay because you've got 20%, at least a ton per person per year. And you can burn a little bit of gas, natural gas and liquid fuels when it's valuable. So that was fine. So people were a little bit, thought, well, we probably will need some CCS, but we don't really need it very badly. CCS, in one form or another, is what puts the net in net zero.
Right. So
Simple
CCS is carbon capture and storage.
Carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
And then it's capturing a source from things that you can't do anything else about. So making cement, making steel, power plants and also it's taking carbon dioxide out of the air for things that you can't avoid doing, either at all. So, for example, emissions from producing food, or things that you want to do, so flying.
Professor Jon Gibbins there from the University of Sheffield. And this might sound terrible to you, but it came as a bit of a shock to me that it was even possible to reverse an oil well. That sounds like amazing technology. Is that something that people are aware of and I've just missed?
Well, the thing about Britain is that we're quite well off for this sort of carbon capture and storage because of our natural resources, if you like. So the North Sea, which was famous for oil and gas, since the 1960s, has got loads of infrastructure, loads of pipes and places where you drill holes to get oil out of. And really, one of the great things about CCS is that although it's a technological challenge, we could kind of reverse the system. So instead of taking stuff out of the ground, we put it in the ground using some of the infrastructure that's already there. So we don't waste all that, huge amount of money that we spent putting all that infrastructure together. But not only that, the people that did it, the expertise, particularly in Scotland, but in Britain generally, that helped to make the oil and gas business a success. Those sort of geologists, those engineers know about this kind of thing. So it's not just reversing the technology, which is a kind of way of thinking about it, but it's also using the people, the skills, and maintaining jobs, maintaining expertise, maybe being able to export it as well. So if we can do it in the North Sea, which we obviously think we can, we could export that to other countries, like India or countries in Southeast Asia, where clearly coal, for example, is going to be used into the future because they're building coal power stations right now. So there's a really good way of looking at it. Another way is that the North Sea is particularly good geologically. It's really a big, kind of great big sink, great big basin, which really is suited to disposing of CO2. And there's very few geological big geological structures of that kind in Europe of the quality in the North Sea. So there's even this idea that we essentially could take CO2 from other countries bordering the North Sea. So it actually could be a kind of center for CO2 for much of Northern Europe. So we're sitting on a bit of a sort of resource positive here for the UK and Norway and Holland, because they all have bits of the North Sea.
See, I find that a really lovely story because, you know, the British kind of started the Industrial Revolution and kick-started all this carbon into the atmosphere. So it would be quite nice if we were also kick-starting the solution, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's an irony in this that, we were, you could blame us all for not only creating this sort of carbon monster, but also, the ways that people have industrialized and all the other stuff that surrounds industrialization. But of course, clever people, being innovative people, I think we can think of our way around it. And this is why I'm actually very optimistic about the world. I mean, I know there's doom and gloom on the telly all the time, but in fact, we're pretty smart. We're good at working our way through problems and doing it carefully and slowly and sorting these problems out. And I'm sure that CCS is one of these solutions. It's not the only one. It's really important to state that, it's something that would be particularly good for industry. But really, stuff like heating homes has to be done in a different way. Obviously, you've got to do it differently. And transport, clearly, we have to do that differently. But it's a way of sorting part of the most difficult problem out.
Yeah, and I think the missing part of this, amazing innovative possibility is the market around it. So someone I want to bring in at this stage is Navraj Singh Ghaleigh, who is an expert in climate law. And he was telling me about the market that we need to create in order to make this work.
If we'd got busy with this, say 20 years ago, and by this I mean with climate action 20 years ago, we might not be having this conversation, but we've left things so late in terms of where the carbon budget is, that if we're to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, not only do we have to mitigate and abate and reduce as far as we conceivably can, in addition to that, we've also got to take a huge amount of greenhouse gases out of the air and store them. That has become extremely clear. It became extremely clear in the last round of the IPCC report, so in the fifth assessment report. One of the things that the scientists did in that was to map out the feasibility and costs of meeting the temperature targets that you find in the Paris Agreement, those 2 degree temperature targets and 1.5 degree temperature target, and map out what it would cost to do that with and without carbon sequestration. And it becomes impossibly expensive if we don't have any sequestration, borderline impossible. So this is just something that we need to do in addition to reducing our emissions as far as possible.
So Jon Gibbins explained, I feel like he was talking in layman's terms for my benefit since I have zero science knowledge, about effectively reversing an oil well. So putting the carbon dioxide back into the deep underground where it will be stored within the porous layers of the earth, which kind of blew my mind. But what I can conceive of is the enormous infrastructure that's going to require and how that even becomes a market. I mean, can you explain that to me?
Sure. So, I mean, as Jon probably explained to you, a lot of the processes, the industrial processes involved in CCS are links in chains which already exist. So the job of capturing CO2 at, say, a power plant is something that we have some idea of how to do, and then turning that gas, those flue gases, into liquids, and then piping, creating a pipeline so that you can ship those liquid CO2 to a storage site and then injecting it. All of those different links of the chain are, more or less understood. What's really missing, and the reason that CCS isn't a mainstream technology today, isn't the absence of scientific knowledge or technical knowledge, it's really the absence of a market to pay for it. The stumbling block for practically all CCS projects has been paying for it. A market hasn't been created for carbon capture and storage, and that's really the job of social scientists and economists and lawyers such as myself to create the necessary regulation. And a really important part of this discussion is the role of the humanities and issues about public acceptance and public understanding of what CCS is, because without social robustness around all of this, we can't expect people to be supportive of CCS or indeed any such climate technology if they don't understand and have confidence that it's not, for example, providing an excuse for oil and gas firms not to abate. They've got to abate. If they think that there's a trade-off between finance for renewable energy and CCS. So all of these are perfectly reasonable considerations, and it's not really the job of a geologist to answer those questions. They've done their bit. I think it's for social scientists now to step up.
So how would we make that argument? How would we persuade people that this is a really good tactic in this fight against climate change?
There's lots of different elements to that. I think the safety issue has to be addressed in a acceptability sense. So people need to understand, for example, that the CCS storage site is not going to blow out in the way that, say, an oil and gas field blows out in the Gulf of Mexico. We're not talking about that sort of phenomena. So that's one issue. The other is that there's a really robust set of procedures around storing CO2. And just as one might be concerned about, say, I don't know, a chemicals factory down the road, and you would expect it to be properly regulated, the fact that it is properly regulated gives people comfort.
Yeah.
Not only to live nearby, but also that this is a place where they can work and have decent livelihoods and communities can thrive.
It's fascinating. And I think when people understand things, they're less afraid of them, right? So there needs to be a bit of an education effort, I guess, to explain, but you also have to recognise those reservations, I suppose. So in the best case scenario, assuming that we do put in place all these things you've just spoken about, how much difference would CCS make?
CCS would make an enormous difference in a number of different ways. I think one thing it would do is it would bring down the cost of decarbonisation very substantially. And that's a societal cost. It's not just a cost to be borne by oil and gas firms, it's a cost that would be borne by all of us. And I think we would all like to win the climate battle more cheaply rather than more expensively. There are also issues about just transitions for oil and gas communities and oil and gas workers. One of the things that I think in the United Kingdom in particular we've been very poor at is industrial transition. So the transition that we witnessed in Scotland and large parts of northern England around coal, say 30, 40 years ago, shipbuilding, steel. These are industries which were once thriving. And instead of being functionally transitioned, we had situations in which those communities and people in those communities were thrown on a scrap heap. One of the things that CCS offers is a partial solution to that problem. So a way in which those skills, those networks, those supply chains can be adapted for carbon capture and storage. By and large, in the United Kingdom, we talk about carbon capture and storage as an offshore venture. We have a pool of workforce, we have skills and technologies which are offshore in nature, and it would be foolishness to discard those. It would also be foolishness to maintain those in their current state. I mean, there is no capacity, climatically speaking, to continue to explore and extract oil and gas fields. So this is a way of bringing those two things together.
It makes perfect sense on paper, but I assume there's a lot of considerations practically. I mean, do you think that, for example, Scotland has an opportunity to show a pilot project, for example?
Well, I think there is a pilot project which is underway, which has just been announced. So the Acorn project is, which will be running through Peterhead, is exactly that sort of opportunity. And a lot of the necessary regulatory elements about assessment and permitting and who owns the pore space and all of that, a lot of that's already in place, which is extremely helpful. Again, what's not in place is the market. So about 10 years ago, there was a lot of hope that through carbon credits, they would fund CCS. So, for every ton of carbon dioxide that you sequestrated, you would be paid the equivalent of the carbon price, and that would be the revenue stream. That hasn't worked out as planned. There are other initiatives which are under consideration. One of the most interesting is something called the carbon take-back obligation. And that is essentially what's called a producer obligation. So the idea of carbon take-back obligation is if you want to extract oil and gas, you can do so, but you've got to sequestrate an equal and opposite amount of carbon dioxide. What you're doing then is creating a market for storage.
And that was Navraj Singh Ghaleigh, who is a lecturer in climate change law at the University of Edinburgh. So how would you like, because it's your area of expertise, what would you like people to take away from this conversation?
Well, I think CCS isn't the answer to everything. It really isn't, because, we've got to change the way we live a bit. And in a way, CCS is a technological solution to a problem which is much bigger than that. It's a bigger human social problem. So, scientists have been guilty in the past of trying to fix big problems with little technology fixes. And we've got to realize that CCS can be a real good fix for industry. It's for refineries, cement factories, fertilizer factories. It's for, industry. It could be for power stations too, but in fact, we would like to do away with coal and gas power stations and go entirely to renewables. And it's unlikely that CCS will be used in the UK for power stations. But for other parts of the world, and this is really important, this is an important message for me, is that although we are doing away with our coal power stations and our gas power stations, much of the world isn't. It really isn't. So in China and in Southeast Asia and India, there are many coal power stations operating and coming online. And these power stations could operate for 30 more years. So we really need to find a way of decarbonising power in some of the emerging economies. And really the only solution is CCS. So I think the story is CCS isn't the solution to everything. It really has to be part of a menu of solutions. But it could be really important for industry, the hard to reach parts of decarbonisation. And it could be really important for the emerging economies, which are still interested and want to use their coal.
And a great opportunity for the UK. If we can lead on some of the technology, if we can make some of these pilot projects work and then offer, as you said, the North Sea is the perfect place, then, that sounds like a good solution to me.
It's a commercial opportunity for us to, show our scientific and technological expertise and export it. It could be a really important solution for not just Britain, but Europe and, other parts of the world.
Emissions Impossible is a Connect production for UK Research and Innovation. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe.